Now, with the announcement of a new Star Wars film that will be set 15 years after the rise of Skywalker, a film that will feature Rey as she rebuilds the Jedi Order, something many hoped and expected to see Luke do or have already accomplished in the sequel trilogy. Anyway, with this announcement at Celebration over the weekend, one thing has become abundantly clear, which is that Disney and Lucasfilm are gambling big on the sequels, betting the future of the franchise on them in more ways than one. Betting there's enough interest in this time period and in the character of Rey to be what returns Star Wars to box office prominence, glory, and most importantly to them, massive profitability. Which is quite an interesting risk to take when you really stop and think about it and look at it from multiple different angles or consider multiple different things here, not the least of which, of course, being the core fandom's reaction to this announcement and their likelihood to support it or reject it. But instead of talking about that, though I'm sure I'll talk more about that soon enough in a video, let's discuss where a good chunk of, and actually the majority chunk of, the box office sales are going to come from or not come from. That being the more casual fan or general audience member or average moviegoer. They will in large part determine the success or failure of this film. And so we have to ask and try to figure out how much interest they either will or won't have in Rey, the premise of her rebuilding the Jedi Order, and the general story of the sequels, of which this will be a rather direct follow-up to. And so far, the reaction I've got from the few friends and family I've talked to about this, and yes, this is completely anecdotal and doesn't mean virtually anything in the grand scheme of things, but pretty much every person I've told about this movie, which is maybe a half dozen or so, has said to me the same one single word, that being, oh. And honestly, it hasn't exactly been a good or bad oh, it's just kind of a surprised one, like, oh, that's the movie they're going to make next. That's interesting, I guess. And after talking to them a bit more, they usually say something along the lines of, they'll probably check it out when it comes out, but there's not a ton of excitement from them. I sensed far more excitement out of them when I told them The Mandalorian and all the other shows attached to it would culminate in a movie someday. That got more of an interested sounding, oh, that's cool out of them. But anyway, setting that aside, I think the best place or way to begin to judge potential interest in this film from the more casual fan or general audience, or interest in the character of Rey in general, would be to see how well the previous films she was in did to take a closer look at the box office numbers for the sequel trilogy. And, well, we'll see that the sequel trilogy lost viewership or ticket sales as it went on, with the final movie of the trilogy making approximately half what the first one did. And though sure, half of that $2 billion The Force Awakens made is still $1 billion, meaning The Rise of Skywalker, out of context, still made a lot of money and was a financial success for Disney and Lucasfilm at the box office. Nevertheless, there's still that pesky matter of only selling essentially half as many tickets as the first film did, to say nothing of poor merchandise sales to the point where you'd be hard-pressed to find anything today with sequel trilogy characters on it, unless it's in a bargain bin somewhere. In other words, those films and characters were on a downward trajectory. People were becoming less and less interested in them as their story or as the films or as the trilogy went on, and their lasting impact on pop culture feels pretty minimal. You don't really see too many people outside the core fandom talking about the impact of these Star Wars sequels. And we're not just talking any old films here or story, we're talking Star Wars and the conclusion of the Star Wars or Skywalker saga, the culmination of 3 trilogies and multiple generations of films. And in theory, if the previous 2 movies had been handled better, had built the story better, Star Wars Episode 9 easily could have been, and really should have been, among the top grossing films of all time, if not the top grossing movie ever. I mean, just look at the excitement that Marvel or the MCU managed to build with the Avengers franchise as it went on. And yeah, sure, Age of Ultron was a minor stumble or setback after the first one, but when all was said and done, Endgame almost doubled what the first Avengers film did, and it also managed to make $750 million more than Infinity War, the lead-up movie to it, meaning, obviously, as it went on, the Avengers franchise only grew and grew in popularity and profitability. Unlike the sequel trilogy that saw things cut in half, it doubled where it had started from. And yes, I realize this is not a perfect comparison for a few different reasons, one of them being that Marvel had other films beyond just the Avengers series itself to build that momentum and excitement and eventual profits. But I'd argue, even despite how massive Marvel was at the time, at its peak in 2018 or 2019, that the Star Wars name or brand, along with the idea of a sequel trilogy of bringing in these original characters, continuing that story, that it was still bigger in concept or theory than Marvel has ever been. Plus, nothing was stopping Star Wars from following a more MCU approach, from slowing down, releasing trilogy films every 3 years or so, like had been done with the previous trilogies, and doing other related films between the saga films to build hype and to build the overall story. This also would have essentially forced them to take their time a bit more with the whole story and have a solid game plan in place for it. And thus, maybe we would have gotten a better, more cohesive story overall from the sequels, and never heard those oftentimes quoted and mocked words about somehow Palpatine has returned, because it either would have been set up and explained from the start, or it would have never happened because they would have come up with a better idea for the story than Palpatine all over again. And so again, just looking at these numbers, looking how they decrease, looking how they are cut in half, literally, I can't help but wonder why Disney and Lucasfilm would double down on Rey and the sequel trilogy. And that is completely excluding my personal opinion on it. Even if I loved those movies, I would still look at this and question, what in the heck are they doing? Why double down on something that, again, was on a downward trajectory and saw interest and revenue cut in half over a 4-year time period, from 2015, from the release of The Force Awakens, till the ending of the trilogy with The Rise of Skywalker in 2019. At face value, none of this seems to make good business sense. You don't need an MBA to look at a line trending down and know you don't bet on it. And one of the often used definitions of insanity is doing the same thing over and over again and expecting different results. For now, one of my only guesses here, and this is just an uneducated guess, you could say, but they fear the unknown more than they fear the recognizable but not beloved. Meaning that instead of trying to do something completely new and different, going to a whole new era on the Star Wars timeline, and yes, I realize they also announced a Dawn of the Jedi movie, which will take the story back 25,000 years, but that's the one that, if I were a betting man, I would bet against the most, and I'd be surprised to actually see it happen, and could also very well be predicated on the success of the Rey movie, keeping in mind Rey is going to be learning from those ancient Jedi texts, written by those first Jedi that the movie would likely be about, so there would ultimately be a connection. Anyway, to me it seems like they're going with something that's at least recognizable to the casual fan or general audience member, plus it is linear, it takes place after the movies they last saw. And so they're going with Rey, who casual fans or general audience members may not have the strongest opinion towards either way, good or bad. I'd also assume that Disney and Lucasfilm are probably hoping that after what will end up being around a 6-year or so absence from the theaters when this film is finally released, that people will also just really want to see a Star Wars film again on the big screen, and that if it's good this time around with Rey and company, that it'll win them over when it comes to the character and they can keep moving forward. Not to mention, I think Grogu will almost undoubtedly be a big part of this film and a big part of the marketing campaign leading up to it. It'll probably be done being a Mandalorian at this point, considering how old Din Djarin would be 15 years after the sequels, assuming he is even still alive. And Grogu will be a part of Rey's Jedi Order. Basically, they're banking on him to get people to turn out if Rey or the Star Wars name alone just isn't enough to put butts in seats when it comes to the more, again, casual fan or general audience member. And I think that will indeed depend greatly on how Grogu is handled in the Mandoverse. I think that, despite what Favreau recently said about bringing him back so soon being his decision and his alone to do so, that Lucasfilm and Disney may have, shall we say, encouraged him to do so, because they don't want him to be too far from the spotlight for too long, that they know he's going to be a big draw or a big part in selling this next film, that Rey on her own is not going to be quite enough, assuming, of course, this movie does actually get made, which is never a certainty with today's Lucasfilm, but I do think it is highly likely. I do think one way or another they are going to find a way to get this one done. Well, that's all I got for you this time. Now it's your turn to take to the comments below and tell me what you think about this one. Do you think the more casual fan or general audience member will line up to see this movie, or is it going to miss the mark with them and ultimately be a flop? Whatever you think, leave those comments below and let's talk some Star Wars. And until next time, thanks for watching.